All right, so we're going to be technically we're in Hebrews chapter 5, but
Not for
we
long.
are looking at this. Yeah, that's right. We're at this passage that the author of Hebrews introduces Melchizedek. And so last week he quotes in chapter 5, verse 5 and 6, or verse 6, he quotes Psalms 110. So last week we went over Psalms 110 to get a picture of the who David was saying the Messiah was going to be and what he was going to look like. And the fact that David was pointing out that the Messiah was also going to be a priest. Um, and according to David, he'll be a priest according to the order of Melchizedek because he was not a Levite, so he could not be an Aaronic priest or a Levitical priest. He had to be a priest from some other way. And David was pointing out that there's this other order that he can belong to, that he's a priest in. So we've been going over that, and we're going to continue this by looking at Genesis and the information we have about Melchizedek. We're just going to look at the picture of who Melchizedek is and talk a little bit about that. There is a bigger, deeper question of who is Melchizedek, and we'll look at that once we get closer to chapter 7, because the author of Hebrews is going to talk more about it. And that's actually, there's a lot of theories and speculation on who Melchizedek is, and a lot of that comes from Hebrews chapter 7. And most of what we know is actually from Genesis chapter 14. And so what we know is there, but then there's speculation from this, what he says. And and I will be honest with you, this is some of the hardest study that I've ever done. I'm not talking specifically about Melchizedek. Hebrews 5, 6, and 7, there is just some tough stuff where he says stuff, and the author says stuff, and I'm like, what are you talking about? And what I'm learning as I'm going through this is there is a ton of context surrounding this book, and I brought this up before. He's directly talking to the Jews of the day, and there's a lot of context that they have that we don't have, and that's part of the reason why this chapter has been so difficult. And it is possible we'll get to it when we get to 7, but I think there's a misunderstanding about who Melchizedek is because there's a missing of some context that's going on, and that I think it helps us to understand it better. But I'm just pointing out, if we're in chapter 5 or 6 or 7 and I say something, you're like, I don't see that in the passage, feel free to speak up, because I could be wrong. Some of this stuff is really tough, and this is what after I've been studying, this is what I've been getting. But feel free to disagree. All right, so let's just read verse 5 and 6 again to just kind of refresh ourselves, and then we'll get back into we'll take a look again at Melchizedek. So, Dad, would you mind reading chapter 5, verse 5 and 6?
Chapter 5 of Genesis,
I'm sorry, chapter 5 of Hebrews.
chapter 5 of Hebrews. Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
just verse 5 and 6, just to give us an overall why we're at where we're at.
Okay. So also Christ glorified not himself to be made a high priest, but he that said unto him, Thou art my son, today I have begotten thee. As he saith also in another place, Thou art a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek.
All right. So again, the author of Hebrews is quoting verse 6, and he talks about how he's going to be a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So I want to take a quick look. This is going to be quick on not who Melchizedek is, but the historical aspect of Melchizedek, the things that we do know for certain about him. There's actually still a lot, and a lot might be over speaking it. Let's just go into it. Genesis chapter 14. So we're in Genesis chapter 14, and just to give us a little bit of context about what's going on, Abram has and Lot have parted ways. Lot lives somewhere else. And there's these five kings that have gotten together and they want people to pay them what they're due, and they don't do that. And so these five kings, sorry, they go in and they take the people and they loot them and some of the stuff. And one of the things they do is they capture Lot. And news gets back to Abram that they've captured Lot. So Abram gathers a force of his men and they go to these kings and they fight them and are victorious and they manage to get Lot and some of the loot and stuff back, and they come back. And so that's a little bit of context of where we're at, but we're gonna read a little more than what we need. So we're gonna read Genesis 14, 8 through 12. Mark, are you up for reading?
I am. Then the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zor, went out and they joined battle in the valley of Siddim. Help me out here. With Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tito, king of Goim, Ampharal, king of Shinar, and Aroch, king of Eleazar. 4 kings against 5. Now the valley of Siddim was full. Huh? Oh,
Yeah.
Dan's enjoying this. I know, Dan. Excuse me, Mr. Simpson. It was verse 10. Now the valley of Siddim was full of Bootman pits. Those like tar pits, right?
Bitumen.
Yeah.
Bitumen pits. All right, thanks. And as the king of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some fell into them, and the rest fled to the hill country. So the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and went their way. Then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, who was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and of Aner. These were allies of Abram. When Abram heard that his kinsmen had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men born in his house, 318 of them, and he went in pursuit as far as Dan. And he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. Then he brought back all of the possessions and also brought back his kinsman Lot with his possessions and the women and the people. Did you say all the way to 18?
I didn't, but you might as well. I mean, because
Okay.
I actually wrote the wrong passage down, so this is fine. This is all good. This is the context that I was talking about.
Cool. After his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed him. Oh, this is verse 19. Whoops.
Yeah, keep going. That's fine. Go up to 19.
Okay.
And 20.
And he 20. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram by Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hands, or hand. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. Keep going.
No, this is good. So here, if we were looking at this passage, again, we have some context. There's this battle going on. He's rescuing Lot. He's finishing with this battle. He comes out, and the king of Sodom and the king of Salem come out to meet him. And if you're reading this passage, there's like this aspect of, where did the king of Salem just come from? Melchizedek wasn't mentioned in any of the things that were going on. Suddenly he's here, and what's really interesting, or I find interesting, there is 3 verses here about Melchizedek, verses 18, 19, and 20. And then when we hit to 21, Abram is back to talking to the king of Sodom, and they have this whole discussion. But Melchizedek is done, right? He's only in these three verses in 18, 19, and 20. And so I just want to point this out. This is what historically we know about Melchizedek. Okay, this is what we know about him. These three verses, 18, 19, and 20. There's no mention of him before this. There's no mention of him after this until David writes his psalm, Psalm 110. And that's almost 1,000 years after this particular event. And then biblically, there's nothing in there at all until he's mentioned here in Hebrews, which is again almost 1,000 years after the psalm is written. So we have this tremendous period of time that happens, and there's a lot of speculation on who he is. But right now, today, we're just before we get into Psalm 7 or Hebrews 7, we'll talk a little bit more about who he is. But today, we're just focusing on the historical aspects, the picture of who Melchizedek is. And again, it's just these three verses. So there are some things though that we do know about Melchizedek that are mentioned here that make things really interesting. First of all, we know his name. His name is Melchizedek. If you were to translate his name, it literally means King of Righteousness. So he's the King of Righteousness. But what's really interesting is he's not the king of a place called righteousness. He's the king of a place called Salem. And Salem means peace. That's where the Jews get their word shalom from. When they say shalom, it's peace. It's also the name of the Canaanite city that is called Jerusalem. So there's a lot of people who think that this Salem, this king of Salem, is actually the same place as the Jerusalem. So he's the king of Jerusalem. Jerusalem does not become a Jewish settlement until after David conquers it and takes it over. Before that, it's a Canaanite settlement. So we have Melchizedek here, who is the king of a place called Salem. And so we know, again, really interesting, he's the king of righteousness and the king of peace. And it's really interesting that these two things are connected, because if he's the king of righteousness and he's the one who has to make sure that things are all right, then that means he's going to be a rough person to be around, because he's going to be judging everything, right? But it also says he's the king of peace. He's literally this king of peace. So, and if you're the king of peace, then you would think, okay, then you're just this nice, person who just lets everything go so that you can have peace. But what we see here is he's not a king of righteousness or a king of peace. He's both. He's both a king of righteousness and a king of peace, where these two places meet, where righteousness and peace meet. So he's got this, just from this picture here, it looks like he's got this great balance of being righteous, but also being peaceful. It's just this really cool little picture that we have here. And I'm going to mention several times how there's this cool little picture here. There's a couple of things that are really interesting about this. One of them is, if the Bible doesn't tell us who he is, why is he important? And one of the reasons that I think he's important is because it's the picture of who he is actually more important than who he is.
Right.
And so we're focusing on the picture of who he is because we don't have all the details of who he actually is. But interesting thing here, he's the king of Salem, and he's Melchizedek, the king of peace. So that's a couple of things we know. Another thing we know is he's not Jewish, right? He's not Jewish, and that may surprise us, but we're talking about Abram. There's no Jews yet. He's the first of the family, right? He's going to have the children of Israel. That's his grandson, and those haven't been born yet. He hasn't even had Isaac at this point. He's just, in fact, he's not even Abraham yet. He's just Abram. So this is all predating that. And what's really cool is that sometimes, because of the way our minds think and because of the way the Bible is recorded, we get this idea that Abram is the only follower of Yahweh. But what we see here is He's not the only follower of Yahweh. Melchizedek is a follower of Yahweh. We see that when it says, verse 18, he was a priest of the God Most High. Excuse me. Again, this predates the term Yahweh. That doesn't happen until Moses. So this is what you would call the God, Yahweh, the God of the Most High. That is a single God who is above all other gods, all over other everything. He's the Most High. And just to clarify it, we see in verse 19, it says, "Blessed be Abram of the God Most High." So there is this picture that both Melchizedek and Abram serve the same God. And so there's this cool thing that God's plan was never to be just the king of the Jews or the God of the Jews. He's always been God of everyone. And here we have this great picture of someone who's following God outside of Abram. Let's see. So I mentioned he is king of righteousness. He is king of peace. He's a Jewish, Salem is not a Jewish city, but a Canaanite city. He is a follower of Yahweh. Another interesting piece about him that we learn in verse 18, it says he was the priest of God Most High. So he's an actual priest. And we talked about last week how to Yahweh, you don't get to approach him in your own way. You don't get to become a priest just because you decide you're a priest. You only get to be a priest when God makes you a priest and finds that you are acceptable. So we have this picture of someone who is acceptable as a priest that is not Jewish. Again, before the Aaronic priesthood, before Aaron and Moses and all of that, we have a priest. And he seems to be a legitimate priest. And why do we say he seems to be a legitimate priest? Because Abram recognizes him so and tithes to him. He actually gives a tenth of what he has to this priest. And again, tithe, he's given a tenth. This is all before there's the law of giving a tenth to priests. Apparently, this was practiced to some degree before God ordained it to Moses.
I'm sorry for
Yeah, go for it.
looking at mine. I'm looking at, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and it just popped in my head. I'm thinking about Jesus and the bread and wine and the Last Supper.
Yeah. It's really interesting, right? Because he doesn't say Melchizedek brings him some food and drink or, has dinner with him.
Yeah.
It says he brings him food and wine. And so there's a clear picture here of Jesus. And I think that's the point of this passage, is it's supposed to be a picture.
So, hey, John, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So if he is a priest, which he is, and it's pre-Jewish ceremonies in regards to what the priests are supposed to be doing, what can we assume is his duties as a priest outside of consecrating food and wine and receiving a tenth?
Yeah. It is a fantastic question. We could speculate that he is also doing sacrifices. And I think we can speculate that because we do find pictures of sacrifice. We do see sacrificing happening before Moses gets on the scene. We know that like Abel is sacrificing a lamb to the Lord. And then there's some other pictures of sacrificing that are happening. Abram sacrifices a ram to the Lord a little bit later. So it is speculation because we're not actually told that. What we can know for sure, assume for sure, is that he is a priest, which means he has one duty in particular that is very specific. He intercedes for man to God. That is what a priest does. Their job is an intermediator between man and God, so that man can approach God. They go through this priest. And that is highly important because that's the point in Hebrews that they're making, the author of Hebrews is making, is Jesus is this high priest, and he's better than the Aaronic priesthood because if you were a priest of Aaron and you had to sacrifice, you had to do it all the time, right? You're sinning, you got to go to the priest to make a sacrifice. You're sinning, you got to go again to the priest and make a sacrifice. You got to, it never ends because it's not good enough. And this is why Jesus is not inside that priesthood, because his sacrifice was good enough and it was sufficient eternally. And so it captures both the past and the present and the future. And so his priesthood is better. But back to your question, Tim, what we can assume is he is a mediator between man and God. And it would appear, since he's an actual priest, I would assume that God is actually speaking to him, that God is speaking to him and he's revealing that to the man, and the people are coming to him and he's interceding for them to God. Because that seems to me, if you boil it down to the very minimum of what a priest does, that's their job. I don't know. Do you guys have any thoughts or comments?
The footnotes of my Bible, it says he's the king of Salem and the priest of the God Most High.
Yeah, yeah.
So he had a powerful position and kind of ran the city.
And historically, from what we know from the family of Abram, there's no other kings who are also priests. David is close, but he is not a priest. He still has some priests that are with him, and they do some of the stuff, although he is highly engaged in it. There's none who are both a priest and a king until
Maybe
Jesus.
people just look for him for guidance, and he had more of an advisory king role than an
That's
actual.
right. So this is cool. So he's the first picture of all of this. And again, I just want to point out, he is a picture of Jesus, and we can see him in this passage. I just want to look at this backwards for just 1 second. If we're just looking through Genesis and we're reading about this Abram, and there is no Jesus, let's assume Jesus hasn't come. So this is, let me rephrase it. Let's assume the Messiah hasn't come. We're a Jew. What are you supposed to do with this passage? Does this passage even make sense? What is the point of this passage? We read 3 verses. What do you think the point of this passage would be if you took Jesus out of the picture? I mean, it doesn't make any sense at all, right? You would be reading this and you'd be like, okay, we're following specifically one family, this whole thread of how the Messiah is going to be born. And then we have this passage about this king. It's 3 verses long, and we don't know hardly anything about him. And you look at it and you'd be like, okay, there's a guy that blesses Abram. I don't know what to do with that. What do I do with that? So it's really interesting, because people might make the claim that we're taking Jesus and we're forcing him in to some of these passages, forcing him into these, prophecies, that these prophecies talk about him. And we're saying they talk about him, and people will push back and say, nah, it could be anybody. But I would point out, this passage makes no sense without anybody else. There's no other person claiming to be both a king and a priest. And the Jews miss this whole aspect of it, that the Messiah was going to be a priest. We talked about that last week. They totally missed this, even though it's clear from David that he's going to be a priest. And so without Jesus, this makes no sense at all. Let's see. I have a couple of other notes. I'm just looking over them really quick. I think we covered everything. Just one thing that I have here in my notes that we didn't cover, which is, this is almost 2,000 years before Hebrews is written. And when the author of Hebrews writes Hebrew, there's some interesting things going on about Melchizedek in that particular time. And that is, historically, if we look at extra biblical writings, there's actually, around the time of Hebrews, there's a lot of writings that include Melchizedek. Some interesting things happen. So from a cultural perspective, it does seem like when the author of Hebrews is talking about Melchizedek, other people are also talking about Melchizedek. They're like, who is this guy? What's the deal with him? And there's some, like I said, there's some Gnostic writings about who he is and some historical writings about who he is and some interesting things that are going on. So it seems like culturally, the people are having a conversation about Melchizedek at the time, which I think is very relevant to why we get chapter 7, why the author writes about who Melchizedek is, because there's a lot of speculation going on. And because of that, he, in a way, addresses some of that. And so we'll talk about that later in 7. And what we want to see here in what we see in Genesis, verse 18 through 20 is that there's not a whole lot to go on. We don't see a whole lot. This guy just kind of pops into history and then immediately pops out of history. And we don't hear anything until David's like, oh, but the Messiah is going to be a priest, just like Melchizedek. And then we're like, whoa, okay. I didn't see that one coming. And then nothing until Hebrews, and until that time after Jesus. So it's really interesting how all of this works. Any last thoughts before we jump back into Hebrews? What do you think about Melchizedek? Interesting guy.
Well, like you said, that it's kind of a Old Testament early version of who Christ is, a little bit. I think that's an important thing that gets looked over a lot of times.
Yeah. And I think when studying through this, I think the biggest point about this is that it's a picture. It's a historical person. It's a real
Right.
person. But because we don't have all the information that we would like about him, that's not what was important. Who he
Right.
is not as important as the picture that he provides for us.
And he was a believer, but he wasn't a Jew.
Yeah, really, really cool
Mhm.
for us non-Jewish people.
Right.
Yeah.
John, are you open, or do you want to wait till later on to get in? He's possibly Christ,
If he's a Christophany or not.
right?
Yeah. Sorry. Let's hold that discussion off until 7, because until chapter 7, because a lot of the proof that people use to say that he's a Christophany comes directly from Hebrews 7 and not from, from what we just read. I don't know if you guys can get that he's a Christophany, that he's Christ there. I don't see that. Maybe you do. So you brought it up, Tim. So let's just do a quick little, just what we're talking about. Some people believe that this is actually Jesus himself, that this is what's called a Christophany, where Jesus is incarnate and he's on the earth. And there are examples of Christophanies in Genesis. There's multiple times that God comes in the form of a man and talks to Abram, and they have a meal together, right? So there is that which people recognize as a Christophany. That is Jesus himself. This one, from just these 3 verses, it's a stretch, I think. But again, I think that the evidence that they use for him being Christ is from Hebrews chapter 7. So I think we'll hold off if he is a Christophany or not for that particular chapter, unless somebody is like, no, we got to talk about it now. All right. Now let's go back to Hebrews chapter 5. Switch. All right, so we just read verses in Hebrews. We read verses 5 and 6, and the part that we were looking at is in verse 6, is it says, "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." And again, so we're going back to Hebrews. We're looking at the main point that the author of Hebrews is making right here in this place, which is that Jesus is our high priest, and if we look at Hebrews in general, the main point of a lot of this is that Jesus is better than, take your pick of thing. He's better. And we've been talking about all of these things he's better than. But now we get to this place where Jesus is our high priest. And the point he's making is that he's better than all of the high priests from Aaron. And he'll get deeper into this, but right now he's just introducing that, because remember, in verse 1 through 4, he talks about how he's a high priest, and there's got to be this thought of, okay, but Jesus doesn't meet the main qualification of being a high priest, which is he's got to be from a son of Aaron, right? In order to be a high priest, you have to be two things. You have to be a man and you have to be a child, or your genealogy has to go up to Aaron. And Jesus doesn't match the second one. He's a man, but his genealogy doesn't go to Aaron. And so the author is pointing out how that wasn't always the case. There was a priesthood before Aaron, and he's of that particular order. So he doesn't need to be a son of Aaron. What's going to be really cool is we're going to see how that makes him better than a priest from Aaron. All right, so let's see, verse 7 and 8. Bill, would you mind reading verses 7 and 8?
During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with the fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission. Son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered.
All right, so now we're going to start. Why is Jesus as a high priest better than all these other high priests? And we start up with this very first thing. It says, who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears to him who is able to save him from death. We see that Jesus takes the place of a high priest and that he is interceding for man to God. He is offering up these prayers and supplications. And this is really interesting that he's doing this. Just again, to point out, we mentioned this a lot last week. Notice that he does not do it according to his own power and own will. He does not come to God the Father saying, okay, I'm God the Son, listen to me. He comes to God the Father at the end of verse 8, it says, I'm sorry, at the end of verse 7, it says, and he was heard because of his godly fear. And I think, Bill, yours said something even a little bit more different, but it was cool. What did yours say?
Because of his
That
reverent submission.
his reverent submission. So there's this point that he's making, is that even Jesus doesn't have the right to approach God on his own terms. He still has to approach God in the way that God desires. He has to do it in submission. So that it's really cool to see that he's doing this. And Tim, you mentioned, what can we assume about him as the high priest Melchizedek? But we can take the same assumption about Jesus as his role of high priest, that one of his duties is intercession for us. He is that mediator between man and God. That is his role. And so there's this really cool picture that we're hearing about him. It says in verse 7, he offered up prayers and supplications. What do you think those prayers and supplications were? What do you think he's praying about?
I would hope he's praying for us. Keep my fingers crossed.
I mean, you don't actually have to keep your fingers crossed, because we know we're
Yeah.
told, and I wish I had that passage, but we are told he does intercede for us daily. But this is just really interesting. And notice the passion with vehement cries and tears. So it's not just like he's interceding. He's like, oh yeah, John has this petition for you. No big deal. If you get some time, take a look at it, God. He's like, there's some passion behind it. He's like, God, you really got to listen to what John is asking for. He's got this request. So I love this picture that we have here of Jesus and how his role is of the high priest.
I'm sorry, Tim, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
He set a perfect example of how we're supposed to live.
This is all good. Tim, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say this pops in my head, the Holy Spirit, when the Holy Spirit groans and we don't understand,
And he
it
interprets that for us.
yes, and this somewhat reminds me. It says fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him. And when we're praying and our simple prayers, and the Holy Spirit's just one upping us to, and I don't mean that in a bad way. He's helping us to communicate what we really need to God.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And that's great because we don't often know what we need and we ask for the wrong
Right.
thing,
Yeah,
right? And
I was
so
trying to say that.
he's able to interpret and say, this is what he really needs, God. Please, listen to that. And so
Yes.
that is great. I find this super comforting when praying with others because I know that I can pray for the wrong thing, right? If I'm praying for someone else, I can ask for the wrong thing. But what is great here is that we have an intercessor who's going to interpret that and ask for the right thing. And so I love that whole aspect. I don't have to be afraid or what's the word I'm looking for? I don't have to be concerned that I'm going to approach God and ask for the wrong thing for another person because I know that I'm going to ask for the wrong thing. He's going to be the one who's going to interpret that in a way that's good.
This also reminds me of the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus was
Yeah.
praying with tears to the one who could save him from death, but he was willing to go through death anyway. There's not my will, but thy will be done.
And there's a great point here that we don't want to miss, where it says it was able to save him from death and heard him because of its godly fear. This is the proof that Jesus is who he claimed he was. The fact that he died and God raised him from the dead, that is God's stamp of approval of, boom, this really is my son. Listen to him. And that's what this author is pointing out. He is the high priest, and we can be assured that he is the real high priest. Because if he was pretending to be a high priest, but he was lying and he died, God would not be okay with that, right? God would be like, okay, you're done. That was it. But God was not like that. God was, you're not done. You're come back to life. And so he has God's stamp of approval. So it's just good. I like the way the author of Hebrews is wording all of this and bringing up all the right points when we need them. All right. In verse 8, it says, though he was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. And so we have this point again, how Jesus was obedient. And this is really interesting. This is our high priest. And we've mentioned it before, how he is both God and he is man. He is man in the sense that he was tempted, right? He physically had to go through the cross. As my dad mentioned, he didn't want to go through the cross. We know that because that's his prayer. He's like, if I don't have to do this, please don't let me do this.
Yeah.
But he did. He was submitted. He was obedient. And so there was temptations. He lived in a world that rebelled against God, and yet he didn't rebel against God. So there's this rebellion that Adam started. He's born into this family. He can see the rebellion. He can understand the rebellion, and yet he doesn't rebel. And so again, there's this picture of how Jesus is better than the high priest. The regular high priest, the priest from Aaron, it's interesting. I don't know if you've caught this, but there's this interesting thing about being a priest from Aaron. The qualifications were that you were a man and that you were a child of Aaron. Notice that none of the qualifications were that you were a good person. None of the qualifications were that you were righteous, because you couldn't do it. It was impossible. And so part of the ceremony where they had the Yom Kippur, where they had to do the sacrifice for the tribe of Israel, the first part of that was the high priest had to give a sin sacrifice for himself before he could do a sacrifice, before he could intercede for the children of Israel. He had to sacrifice for himself because he was not righteous. But Jesus is better because he was righteous. He doesn't have to do a sin sacrifice for himself. He is the sacrifice for mankind because he's found perfect. He was perfectly submitted, even though he experienced and saw this rebellion that mankind was in. So we can't look to God and say, okay, God, you don't understand what I'm going through. You don't understand all the tough things that I'm doing, because he can say, no, I sent this mediator, Jesus, who was man. He knows what you were going through. He experienced the curse in the sense that he was here on earth, was living in this fallen world, and he understands us. So it's cool. It's good. I like this whole thing about how he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. All right. Verse 9 and 10. Verse 9 says, actually, I'm going to let someone else read it. Let's see, who hasn't read? Tim, would you mind reading verse 9 and 10?
And once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, and was designated by God to be high priest in the order of Melchizedek.
All right. So we have again, we got to preface a little bit or back up a little bit. In verse 9, it says, and having being perfected. Some people misunderstand this, and I know we're not, but just so we're clear and all on the same page, this isn't saying that Jesus was perfected and that he wasn't perfect and then he learned how to be perfect. The point of this perfected is that he was perfect and then he demonstrated that perfection through his life here in a fallen world. So that's what this whole perfected was, is he came to earth, lived in a fallen world, and did not sin. So he was perfect. And he proved that he was perfect by doing that. And that's what this idea of perfection is. It's not that he not that he was imperfect and became perfect. It means that he proved it. It was accomplished. And that word perfected, that's a good word for it. It means accomplished. And then it says, let's see. Here is my favorite verse of this so far. Verse 9, it says, having been perfected, I like this part next, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him. Eternal salvation. And this is a gigantic concept. I love this idea. Eternal salvation to all who obey him. So it's available to everyone, to those who are willing to obey him, but it's eternal salvation. And I like this word, and I want to bring up a couple of points here. I want to say I have a pet peeve, but it's really not a pet peeve. But there is a phrase that people use frequently, which gets me the wrong way, and that's because I'm a math guy. People will say that God is infinite and man is finite. Usually they'll end it with the man is finite part. God is infinite, man is finite. And I don't really like that, because that doesn't understand the term of infinity. The concept of infinity is that you can keep going one more, and there's always room for more. You can keep going. So the number system, they're infinite. There's no matter, you could go through every single number and you're never going to hit the end, because there's always more numbers. And so that's this idea of infinity, is that it goes on and there's always room for more. And so there's a misunderstanding, because if we say that man is finite, there's a misunderstanding of that, because according to what we're told from the Bible, we're going to exist forever, which means we're not finite. We're actually infinite. We have no end, according to what we're told. We're going to exist forever. So we're not infinite. I mean, we're not finite. We're actually infinite. But that does not mean So then we can get confused. Well, if we're infinite and God's infinite, then we're the same. And we're not the same. And there's a problem that we have in misunderstanding infinity. You can have something that is infinite, which is also smaller than something else that is infinite. And I'll give you an example of this. This is my fun math for today. After today, you can say you're done with your math for the week. If you take all the numbers between 0 and 1, that's an infinite set of numbers. No matter how many numbers you try to count, there's always one more number you can stick inside of the numbers between 0 and 1. Okay, 0.1, 0.2. I'm not going to list them all because I can't. There's too many. It's infinite. But
Yeah.
all the numbers between 0 and 2, that's also infinite. There's an infinite set of numbers between 0 and 2. However, the numbers between 0 and 2 are larger than the numbers between 0 and 1. And how do we know that? Because all the numbers between 0 and 1 fit inside of the numbers between 0 and 2. And all the numbers between 0 and 2 do not fit in between the numbers of 0 and 1. So we have two infinite sets, but they are not the same. And one is bigger than the other. All the numbers in the world, that's another set of infinite numbers. And that's much bigger than any of the 0 and 1 and 0 and 2. So we have this. And so this whole concept in my mind is confusing. When we say that God is infinite and we are finite, we're technically wrong because we are also infinite in some certain terms, but we're trying to compare ourselves to God in a way that just doesn't work.
God existed before he created us.
And this
So
gets back to,
he existed
go ahead.
before he created us. So when he created us in his image, well, we became infinite from that point, but God all existed.
Yes, yes. And this is why I like the word eternal. And this is what the verse is saying is that, and this isn't even saying that God's eternal. There's others that say that, but this one is saying that he gave us eternal salvation. And the word eternal talks about not only the future, but it also talks about the past. It's talking about all of time. So God gave salvation that covers all of time. And that's what I like about eternal. We can say God is eternal. And I think because God is eternal and he is self-existing, I think that when you put those two things together, it proves that God exists outside of time. He existed when there was no time. So he covers all of time past, all of the present, and all of time future. And so God is so much bigger. And so when we say he's eternal, that's what we're talking about. He exists outside of time. We are not eternal in that sense because we don't exist throughout all of time. We were born and then we existed and then we go on forever, but we don't have access to the past, but God does. And so when we talk about he gave us, he authored eternal salvation. He's talking about our salvation that covers all of time. It covers the things in the past, in the present, and in the future. And this is an interesting concept because we don't often think about this. If Jesus is the author of eternal salvation, what does that mean? Bless you. What does that mean for the people who were died before Jesus? How do they have eternal salvation? What do you guys think about that? How do you think they have eternal salvation? Do they have salvation? If you happen to live before Jesus, does that mean you couldn't be saved? What do you guys think? Is this too weird of a concept?
Oh, I think the people in the Old Testament were saved, who believed in God and led a appropriate life for the time before Jesus.
So you can bring into scripture the passages in I'm blanking on the book, but it's referred to as Abraham's bosom, and that's where the people who are not saved in Christ were patiently waiting for Christ to appear and do his work.
Yeah, yeah.
And then when that happened, they were removed from that. That's one credible theory.
Yeah. I mean that's good. It's interesting from what you said though. They're still saved by Jesus, right? Jesus is still involved in their salvation. And
Well, you can take it
Oh, go
even
ahead.
farther. Is what did Christ do when he was gone for 3 days? Did he go down and preach his gospel to those people and they accepted? Or and maybe it would hard to believe that none of them wouldn't believe or wouldn't accept. Some people say that's what happened when he was gone, and then those people were just transferred to wherever Christ's paradise is at that time.
So I would push, I don't know what the right phrase is. I would push a little bit on that and then just in the sense that if we're looking at how they're saved in the Old Testament and we look at this verse of he's the author of eternal salvation, this is interesting because I think what it's saying is they are saved through Jesus. They're saved through Messiah, but they don't know who he is. And that's the interesting aspect of it. When we look at David, I've been reading a lot of Psalms lately, and I love how he just is constantly saying, I will put my trust in him. And he's saying, I'm going to put my trust, God, in you that you're going to save me. And what he's communicating is, I don't know who you're going to send to save me. I don't know how you're going to save me, but I am trusting that you're going to do it. And so what he's actually doing is saying, I'm trusting in the Messiah to save me, but I don't know what that even means. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know how that's going to be, but I'm going to trust that you're going to do it. And so what we see then is they're saved through trust in Jesus, but they don't know his name. They don't know who he is. They don't know exactly what he's like. Now we live in this time after that where we know who Jesus is. So we say, I put my trust in Jesus. We have a better understanding of what that means than they did, but it doesn't matter how much we understand it. It's the fact that we put our trust in him to save us. So I think this is really incredible. Go ahead, Dad.
There was a priestly order before the Jews, which you brought up at the first of the study.
Yeah.
The order of Melchizedek. They were priestly people who were worshiping God. You just can't say, well, okay, they didn't know Jesus, so that's tough.
Yeah.
You know, whether a person's saved or not, that's between them and God. I could never guess when somebody else is saved or not. I don't care if he was an Aborigine or what he was. I'm sure God knows the heart and God knows the mind. And God will look at them and judge them according to what they know. So,
Yeah.
But there was, like you were saying, the point I was trying to make is there was a priestly order before the Jews. So it wasn't the Jews that provided salvation. The Jews provided Jesus, which solidified salvation, but salvation has always been there.
That's a good way to put it. I like that. God has always had a plan for salvation. We just didn't know the details until Jesus came. But because he's always had a plan, if we put our trust in that plan, then we're saved. So it's this whole thing is incredible. I really enjoyed. We're out of time, so we're gonna have to end. I just want to point out I have really enjoyed this particular study, but we get into verse 11 and things get, even in my opinion, as I've been studying through this, they get even more tough and more difficult to work through what the author is trying to talk through. And my experience has been so far, this is incredible. God is incredible. Jesus is amazing. And there's some depth to him that is that we sometimes miss, and it's so hard to sometimes get through to it. But then when we do, it's so amazing and it's so worth it. So I'm just pointing out that I'm excited for the next passages too, because it's hard, but it's been so rewarding getting through them. So I'm looking forward to it. It is time to pray and end. Tim, would you mind praying for us this morning?